Thank you all. I'd like to get started so we can keep on time, and importantly, keep up the party aspect of the tradition of Pacific Day turning to Pacific Night. Thank you very much. Well, welcome back. I'd like to introduce. Actually, I won't make introductions of each panelist because we'll have more time for discussions. We are going to. I will introduce the panel though in the order that they're listed on your program. What we've got is a great discussion of some of the key issues that the Minister and Secretary Brimmer touched on in their discussions. We're going to go into a little more depth, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to make very brief comments from their expert perspectives, and then we're going to open the floor up for discussion. After that, we will enjoy the Pacific Night, which is something I know you're all looking forward to. Let me open by introducing Ambassador Robert Aisi, the chair of the Pacific Small Island Developing States Group and the permanent representative of Papua New Guinea to the UN. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll take your short seriously, and I will be short and brief. I am the Ambassador of Papua New Guinea, as mentioned by the chair, and I'm here to talk a little bit about what we do at the United Nations. On an annual basis, there are about 170 items on the agenda, with many, many sub-items under them, and I don't propose to go through them here. But I did pick three issues that I'd like to focus on, and the first one is on the development agenda. The second relates to the issue of international peace and security, and the third is on the political process as far as the Pacific countries are concerned at the United Nations. Let me preface my comments by saying that Article 2.1 of the United Nations Charter guarantees equal sovereignty to all of us as member states, whether you're a little small state in the Pacific or the big Chinas and the Russias and the US of this world. All of us have one vote, but I think the reality, as you will see later in my conclusion, is a little bit different. Insofar as my first area of discussion is concerned, on the development agenda, I will not speak on climate change nor the upcoming Rio summit because my colleague, Ambassador Moses from Nauru, will cover that adequately. But what I did want to mention under the development agenda was two issues. One is the participation of our women in the Pacific. I think all of us know now that it is such a critical development component that we have to have a gender policy, mainstreaming if you like, but certainly having our women participate actively in not only the economic life of our countries, but in the political process also. The second point, a little bit related to that, is what's been referred to as the youth bulge in the Pacific. And I would probably refer more specifically to the Melanesian region of our region, but I would suspect that that's also a problem in many, in the Polynesian and the Micronesian regions also. And why I mention those two is because we have to get those two aspects of our society right. And the challenges out there, I know it's been alluded to, but I would suggest that while the youth bulge can be seen as a negative, it can also be seen as a positive, and both distinguished speakers who spoke this afternoon also referred to the opportunities, and I would suggest that the opportunities are there for us to grasp. And a lot of that will be challenging, but I think mentioning it is important. The second thing is the next matter is in relation to the non-communicable diseases. Last year, as was mentioned, we had the high-level meeting at the United Nations. One of the things about non-communicable diseases is that they are preventable. And I think too often we look elsewhere, particularly from the region, but probably the solutions are at home. So I think that's one area that we should be looking at, which is prevention. Recently I met with the IAEA officials, and for many of us, when we talk about the IAEA, it's about nuclear weapons, Iran, et cetera, But they have a cancer program there, cancer prevention program there that we could also hook into. The last point I wanted to raise under the heading of the development is the blue economy, and I'm sure my colleague will cover that in precise details. When we raised this at the United Nations recently under the discussions of going forward to Rio Plus summit, many considered the issue of blue economy as contradicting the green economy. Nothing could be worse. Nothing could be less than the truth. In fact, if you look at small states, and as Minister Makali alluded to, when you look at a country like Kiribati with so much maritime area, you'd have to give the idea of blue economy a serious thought, because there are many, many things there apart from the fisheries issues. Our sea lanes, the use of airspace is important, and I would suggest to you that use of sea lanes are important. The maintenance of the marine areas, marine space, are just as important as maintaining terrestrial integrity. Let me move on quickly, because time is moving on to international peace and security. I've noted that many of our countries here in the Pacific are contributors to the maintenance of international peace and security. Fiji obviously is our great leader in that, including Australia and New Zealand. But let me note that there was one policewoman from Palau who served recently in Sudan. Of course, other members of the Pacific serve in other international theatre. Recently, my Tongan colleague mentioned to me that they were going off to the NATO summit, and I asked why. And I forgot that Tonga is part of ISAF in Afghanistan. So, small as we are, we have, in my view, contributed to the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations in maintaining international peace and security. I would mention that our people are in Iraq, Lebanon, well, used to be in Lebanon, Sudan, South Sudan, and in the Sinai. Other aspects of international peace and security we get involved in at the United Nations is in the negotiations involving the proposed arms trade treaty. We have also been engaged in the non-proliferation treaty process. I remain a vice chair of that. Why is it important? Well, many of you know, may not know, also that the Rarotonga Treaty is still part of instruments that govern a nuclear-free Pacific. At the recent summit, Secretary Clinton had noted that the U.S. would ratify. We are aware of the difficulties that the U.S. has, but we welcome that statement. Of course, small arms is a big issue, and I would again refer to my region, Melanesia, specifically Papua New Guinea, as problem areas. But I also suggest that the huge maritime areas that we have allow for small arms proliferation. So all of us have a stake in this. It is, as far as Papua New Guinea is concerned, a huge financial burden on our economic development. The last point I'd like to raise is, how do the Pacific small island developing states engage with everybody else at the United Nations? As I mentioned earlier, Article 2.1 gives us one vote, like everybody else. And the voting systems, as we've seen, where majorities are required for certain seats or positions at the UN, I mentioned UN Security Council, the 11 votes that we have become extremely important, in my view. Now, how those votes are lobbied vis-a-vis each of the countries is up to those who are seeking to get on those various bodies of the UN. But I would suggest to you that we, the small island states of the Pacific, being able to leverage our vote in an effective way does help the first issue that I covered, which is the development agenda. So, we may be small, but I would like to say here, Mr. Chairman, that we do have a voice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me introduce Marlene Moses, the Ambassador and Permanent Rep of Nauru to the UN and Chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good evening, everyone. I would just like to touch on the priorities of the Alliance of Small Island States. My country, Nauru, assumed the chair of AOSIS January this year. AOSIS is a group of 43 countries most vulnerable to climate change. Within our membership, climate change is an existential threat to a number of our members, and our group of low-lying island and coastal nations was one of the first bloc to sound the alarm about climate change over 2 decades ago, ahead of the first Rio Earth Summit. And at the same summit, the particular needs and vulnerabilities of small island developing states were officially recognized. Since then, AOSIS has evolved into one of the most visible players at international climate negotiations and at the United Nations. We are recognized for the moral authority that comes from representing some of the smallest and most vulnerable states. Because if the international community cannot ensure the continued existence of all states, and if we cannot ensure that all states are on the path towards sustainable development, then we all have failed. And I regret to say that currently we look to be far from that path. In climate change, despite 2 decades of escalating warnings and costly impacts, we have made insufficient progress towards lowering the greenhouse gas emissions responsible for climate change, responsible for the climate change crisis. And despite increasingly dire warnings, the science, the political appetite to do what is necessary is at the lowest point I can remember. And I just returned last week from the climate talks in Bonn, where AOSIS presented our work plan, appropriately entitled Our Work Plan for Survival, which highlights and articulates the immediate need to begin raising mitigation ambition to the level required to keep climate change to levels well below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I wish I could say it was warmly embraced, but the response was, to be diplomatic, really lackluster. And increasingly, it seems that within the UNFCCC negotiations, the political will to take hard decisions, the type of decisions needed for us to avoid catastrophic change to our world, is really not there. Unfortunately, on sustainable development for small island developing states, the picture is not much better. And to give one example, recent assessments show that we are falling short, and that SIDS are falling short on commitments made under international agreements. So long as these gaps remain, SIDS will be unable to achieve the sustainable development for which we all strive. This gap on implementation is one of the issues which AOSIS is seeking to highlight at Rio Plus 20 in a couple of weeks. Assessing these gaps between what we have agreed to and what we have actually done is one piece of the puzzle for Rio. But the heart of our Rio objective is to secure renewed political commitment for sustainable development. This is, of course, an admirable goal, securing renewed political commitment. And it is one which we should be seeking not only at Rio, but at the UNFCCC negotiations and in the multilateral system. I believe that the world has become complacent as the challenges have grown greater for SIDS. And as leaders, we cannot allow this to continue. We have a responsibility to our citizens to ensure they are aware of just how serious the situation has become and the enormous effort that is required to manage it. We need to both catalyze and demonstrate political will to ensure that what we agreed to at UNFCCC, at Rio, at the United Nations, and more, are just not more than just words, that we are doing more than just putting on a show, and unfortunately, that's the way business is conducting at the moment. As initial steps then, we need to urge the full implementation of past commitments. This includes parties' commitments to be effected under the UNFCCC. Meeting these existing commitments is a minimum threshold to begin tackling climate change, a cross-cutting issue which we have acknowledged requires urgent international action. Indeed, political will at the highest level is required to strengthen the climate change negotiations. Otherwise, climate change threatens to undo any progress made towards sustainable development, especially for the SIDS. We need to make good on the promises we have made on oceans, such as recommitting to mainstreaming or restoring depleting fish stocks and addressing IUU fishing. We must also move beyond existing commitments to new commitments which address the new and emerging issues. For example, in the last several years, we have learned much more about the threat that ocean acidification is becoming, and we must take decisive action to address it. We need to commit to supporting initiatives that address ocean acidification, as well as enhance the resilience of ocean ecosystems. And we need to ensure time for contemplation. And I say this because in the same way that Rio allows us as an international community to take stock, the 20th anniversary of the original SIDS conference will give SIDS a timely opportunity to take stock of how far we as a group have come and how much further we still have to go. And in this vein, the Pacific have called for the convening of a Sustainable Development Conference for SIDS in the Pacific in 2014. Finally, Mr. Chair, it is my sincere hope that the entire Pacific will start a new conversation about the ways we can align our mutual interests, which ultimately must include preserving the atmosphere that sustains us all, to ensure our whole community can enjoy the opportunities the future offers. Thank you.
A powerful call, Ambassador. Thank you. Let me introduce Durwood Zaki, who's the president of the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, especially on this panel with Ambassador Moses and the ambassador from Papua New Guinea. My story starts 5 or 6 years ago when the late Ambassador Masao Nakayama called me and said, our mutual friend, Sebia Hawkins, told me to call you to see if you could help us in the islands come up with strategies that could slow the rate of sea level rise and strategies that could do this fast. I said, well, thank you, Sebia. This is quite a challenge. And I said I would be happy to try to do this. And we convened a group of Nobel laureates, Dr. Mario Molina, Paul Crutzen, Sherwood Rowland, several other scientists from Scripps Institution in San Diego, Professor Ramanathan. And we came up with a strategy to focus on short-lived climate pollutants that could cut the rate of global warming in half for the next 50 years, and could cut the rate of warming in the Arctic, which is critical for the world, by 2/3. This seemed like a pretty good plan. Short-lived climate pollutants include black carbon, and we heard Minister Macaulay mention this earlier, that the dirty diesel that powers so much of the electricity in the islands is putting black carbon into the atmosphere. We now know that black carbon, or soot, is the second largest contributor to climate change after CO2. Not many people know this, but it is number 2. Second is, on the short-lived climate pollutant list, is methane. Methane is the precursor to tropospheric ozone, which not only causes warming, but also damages photosynthesis, including food production, as well as carbon storage. And then finally, on the short-lived climate pollutant list are fluorinated gases, F-gases. We use these for refrigerants in our air conditioners, in our mobile air conditioners, in our refrigerators, and so on. Now these together, these short-lived climate pollutants, are big. They're 45% of climate forcing, 45% of the cause of climate change. They're fast because they have a short atmospheric lifetime. between days in the case of tropospheric ozone to about a decade and a half for the fluorinated gases. This is very fast compared to CO2. People don't fully appreciate that a quarter of CO2 stays in the atmosphere for millennia, thousands of years. I mean, this problem of CO2 is even bigger than many of us recognize, and I give Ambassador Moses great credit for trying to bring this to the attention of people in the UNFCCC, even though they're not always listening to us. So these strategies also have great collateral benefits. Black carbon kills almost 5 million people a year, mostly women and children. We can save those lives. It suppresses food production by 5%. We need to feed a growing population who are underfed already. So these strategies can help us tremendously. They can be done all with existing technologies and often with existing laws and institutions and outside of the slower UNFCCC process, slower at least at the moment, where we're struggling. So this could complement very much what we're doing there. Ambassador Nakayama said, okay, let's do it. I said, great. And he said, but that means you have to help. So for the last 6 years, I've been working to help deliver this strategy with many, many other people. We started with the Montreal Protocol because that's what regulates most of the fluorinated gases. And in 2006, the Federated States of Micronesia rounded up a group of allies from island states and others and said, why don't we turn this treaty, that's actually been the best climate treaty so far, into an even stronger climate treaty? What we discovered was that the Montreal Protocol and other efforts to solve the F-gas problem have already solved an amount of climate problem that otherwise would be equal to CO2. This is a phenomenal accomplishment through this treaty and related national laws. Micronesia and its allies succeeded in 2006 in accelerating the phase out of one of the fluorinated gases, HCFCs, and delivered for the world mitigation of about 5 times more than the Kyoto Protocol in its first commitment period. This year, this month, the Federated States of Micronesia then said, let's amend the Montreal Protocol further so that we can now remove what is the fastest growing greenhouse gas in the United States, HFCs, that we make. They're factory-made gases. Let's stop making them. Micronesia filed its proposed amendment May 11th. The North American parties of US, Mexico, and Canada filed a similar amendment. And that amendment has been supported already in the past year by 108 countries. And it will deliver 100 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, which is about 5 to 8% of what we need to stay below 2 degrees. That's not enough. We need 1.5 degrees, but this is a big contribution to them. The G8 announced on Saturday that this was President Obama in his press conference, announced that they were joining a new coalition that was announced in February to cut the short-lived climate pollutants. It's called the Climate and Clean Air Coalition to Reduce Short-Lived Climate Pollutants. It includes now 18 parties, including the United States, many developing countries, many developed countries, the World Bank, UNEP, and the European Commission. The World Bank reported at the first ministerial meeting last month in Stockholm that they already had $12 billion, not million, but $1 billion invested in projects that could reduce these short-lived climate pollutants. So let me conclude by saying, again, this strategy, which complements the strategies for reducing CO2, can cut the rate of warming in half for the next 50 years and the rate of warming in the Arctic by 2/3, and slow sea level rise significantly. It'll also, I believe, deliver some momentum to keep us from going from climate denial to climate despair, which is now beginning to infect the world because we're struggling with solutions. These solutions on the non-CO2, short-lived pollutant side can show us that we are smart enough to solve climate change and help us solve the biggest piece, which is CO2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some amazing numbers there and amazing progress. Let me introduce Kate Brown. Kate is the coordinator of the Global Island Partnership. Kate, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So the Global Island Partnership is a partnership focused on catalysing action on conservation and livelihoods on islands around the world, and we're chaired by the presidents of Palau, the Seychelles, and the Prime Minister of Grenada. So it's really looking at how do we make something happen around conservation and livelihoods because of the importance island people place with it. And I think I wanted to reflect a little bit for the Pacific, and I have a lot of work experience in the Pacific, not just based in Washington, D.C. The biodiversity in the Pacific is in real trouble. We know that it's being lost, and we know it's accelerating. We know we are losing more and more of it. And that's critically important because, as we know, we really define ourselves by what our natural resources and our environment, and is an important part of how we live in the Pacific Island region. So we also know what the drivers of biodiversity loss are and loss of ecosystem services, and I think Ambassador Moses talked about climate change, really critical issue. There are other issues, including habitat change and invasive alien species, which people might know, things like the brown tree snake in Guam, red imported fire ant, and so forth. And there's also problems with overexploitation and pollution. But I'm not here to talk about the details of the problems. I'm really going to talk about what some Pacific Island countries are actually doing to address some of these problems themselves. And that, I think, is what a lot of islands around the world, because I work on islands around the world, are really looking to the Pacific for this type of leadership. It started back in 2005 with a major commitment at the Mauritius meeting in Mauritius by Fiji, which really catalysed a whole range of other high-level commitments by Pacific Island countries to conservation and livelihoods, and the link that that makes to development in these countries. And some of the examples of that are the Micronesia Challenge, which some people might know something about, with 5 chief executives of 5 jurisdictions in Micronesia have made a significant commitment to conservation and livelihoods. But we also have things like the Coral Triangle Initiative, the 2 countries, the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, that are involved at a very high level in that. We have the Kiribatis Phoenix Island Protected Area, which is actually, and interestingly following the minister, the largest marine protected area in the Pacific Ocean, and at one point it was the largest marine protected area in the world. And it's also the largest marine conservation effort by any least developed country in the world. This is a huge effort, and it's a sacrifice, but it's a commitment to the future. And we also have the pending announcement at the next forum in the Cook Islands, by the Cook Islands, of a new 900,000 square kilometre marine park that they're going to announce there, and they've been talking about it at various global events. And the common thread in this is really about political leadership for conservation and livelihoods, and the identification of some sort of an aspirational target which links conservation to development. And this is a really important part of this. And really, the next stage is really looking at what is the cost of taking action? What is the cost of actually meeting and addressing that target? And then countries themselves are actually committing resources, their own resources, to achieving this. But what and there's really great examples, including a range of tools, sustainable financing mechanisms. And I just want to draw your attention to one by Palau last year. They have a green fee, it's an environment protection departure fee that people that are not Palauan pay at the airport, and you probably have seen people maybe complaining about paying it. But all of the Palau president in October last year allocated all of the receipts of that green fee for 2011 to Palau's protected area network. And so that came to $1.4 million US. That's a big commitment by Palau. But also, they're looking at things like more effective management of money, more effective management through trust funds and things like that. And we have the example of Mama Ground in Papua New Guinea, and also the Micronesia Conservation Trust. And so what we see here is countries, and I think it really follows on from Ambassador Moses, making a commitment themselves. but they need help with the gap between what they're able to actually support themselves and what the aspirational target is. And that's really what we see people trying to put to the global community. And I think, just to give you some sense of the scale, and I am focusing on the Micronesia Challenge because they've done a lot of work on the financing aspect, but the first phase of the Micronesia Challenge, the first 5 years, was $18 million based on developing a sustainable financing plan. And I believe about 80% of that has been raised to date. The next phase is $54 million US. They have a huge jump now. And I think this is a really important point, and I really wanted to conclude with just something that the Vice President of the Federated States of Micronesia said at an event we had in 2010 in the margins of the UN General Assembly. He actually was talking about why the Federated States of Micronesia became involved in the Micronesia Challenge. He said that we believe that this commitment for building resilience to climate change impacts, which will help us protect our natural resources and ensure food security for future generations, having a natural, healthy resource base is fundamental for our social and economic development, which is at the core of our national objectives. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Let's turn to economic prospects for the Pacific Islands, and it's my pleasure to introduce Patrizia Tumborello, the head of the Pacific Islands Unit at the International Monetary Fund.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank also Ambassador Moore for inviting me and representing the IMF at this high-profile event. As I'm an economist, I would like to focus my short intervention just putting on the table what are the economic challenges, but also the opportunities that the Pacific Islands face, and also give a little bit of the global landscape, and then maybe other points can be follow up on the question later. So just by focusing on what are the stylized facts on the Pacific Islands, we call it Pacific Islands, but actually are very heterogeneous countries. But they're all small, they're open economies, they're very scattered. We know that the cost of government per capita is higher in these economies because of a small population, and they face the challenge of having a less diversifiable export and production base compared to other countries. So all this adds, economic cost. They are particularly subject to commodity price shocks, and given that commodity prices have been very volatile over the last 10 years, this has added an extra challenges. And because of the narrow production economic base, we say that they face what in economics we call diseconomies of scale. However, they also have larger opportunities. One is their geographical location. They are regionally integrated with New Zealand, Australia, and lately also with emerging Asia. We think that this provides resilience to shocks more than other islands in other parts of the world. I'm thinking about the Caribbean, whose business cycle is related to economies that have not been doing as well as Asia and Australia and New Zealand. And this provides a lot of opportunities. Now, the relationship with Australia and New Zealand, economic relationship with Australia and New Zealand are well established, but the integration of China is relatively new. But we know from the economic data that trade with China has increased by 7 times since 2000. And for some of the Pacific Islands, China is actually the first trading partners. I'm thinking, for example, about Solomon Islands. And external financing from China to Tonga is also very relevant in terms of GDP. So this particular location provides the opportunities to be part of what we call the Asia supply chain, and therefore, the economic prospect can also increase because of that. We see opportunity for private sector development, also in niche sectors, in ecotourism, but also, exploiting better the large marine resource endowment in the world that you were mentioning about early on. If we have to look forward, given what is happening to the global economy and the uncertainty surrounding the global outlook, we see two main challenges. The one is for this economy to rebuild resilience to shocks. These are economies that are subject to all sort of shocks, including natural disaster and climate change. It's impossible to internalize the cost of climate change for any single economy without the help of the international community. For building buffers, what we mean is that basically countries should save for rainy days, so building more reserves when it's possible, but we also think about policy buffers, having lower debt in order to have more fiscal space to support the economies in bad times. And the help of the development communities, of course, has helped the Pacific Islands a lot. A lot of aid is provided in form of grants, and this has allowed them also to have lower debt. And this is why during the recent crisis, they haven't suffered as much as the Caribbean. And the last point I want to make is that they need also to foster inclusive growth. This is a dear concept to the IMF, especially to the managing director. What do we mean by inclusive growth? A growth that benefits all sectors of the economy, that increases jobs. Now, for commodity exporters like Solomon Islands, and I just came back from there, or Papua New Guinea, this means really reaping the benefit of the revenue, so having the right tax system so that the government can raise a fair amount of revenues and then redistribute this to invest in priority spending. And for other countries, it means to prioritize better public spending, health, education, and infrastructure, and pass the structural reforms that will allow growth to be more resilient. This reform should be done, should be passed in good times. It's very hard to, as we know from also other part of the world, it's very hard to pass structural reforms when countries are in recession. So if I have to sum up, I would say that the prospect for the region, for the Pacific Islands, remain good, but given the global uncertainty, there is a lot of scope also for domestic policy, therefore for policymakers, to focus on the structural reform that could turn the challenges into opportunities.
Thank you, Patrizia. Thank you very much. Everybody's staying on time, Eddie. So you've got a big topic. You've got a big topic to cover, my friend. This is. I'm going to turn to our last speaker, the role of major powers in the Pacific, and our speaker is Eddie Walsh, who's a journalist and a non-resident fellow at the Pacific Forum, CSIS, which is based in Hawaii. Eddie.
Aloha, Your Excellencies, and distinguished guests. In the last few decades, there's been a huge shift in the world that we've all noticed. There's been tremendous economic growth in the Asia Pacific, and over this period, we've seen not coincidentally, a relative state of peace and stability in the Asia Pacific Rim area. In the absence of conflict between major powers, the region has experienced significant trade liberalization, typified most recently by the movement towards the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As a result of all these factors, the Asia Pacific has emerged as a key driver of the world economy. Unfortunately, the same factors which have led to wealth and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region are now starting to put strain on the existing glue which holds the system together. The multilateral system, which is a remnant of the 20th century, no longer accurately reflects the global balance of power. In the absence of a formal security architecture, rising powers, particularly China, have periodically challenged the regional framework of rules-based order in the Asia-Pacific. In response to the increasing assertiveness by China, the U.S. very publicly signaled its strategic commitment to the region last year. The U.S. government then launched a campaign. It's a campaign that I would define as a dissuasion campaign to dissuade China from further challenging the status quo. This has included strengthening U.S. cooperation and coordination with regional allies, implementing new trade and investment initiatives, expanding military footprint in the region, increasing participation in the regional multilateral institutions, and of course, trying to more constructively engage rising powers, including China. The vigor of the U.S. response and the subsequent support, especially in Southeast Asia, of some of China's neighbors has been met with somewhat of an unease in Beijing. The Chinese security scholars are concerned, and perhaps justifiably, that the US rhetoric belies something more sinister. The term containment is often used by both sides in describing the relations in the area. US assurances otherwise do little to sort of assuage the concerns right now. So I ask you to think about the role of major powers, and I talk major powers, I'm talking Australia, China, the US, New Zealand, and Japan, in the larger context of the Asia Pacific. The security complex that used to exist in the Pacific is so intimately linked with the Asia security complex, they must be considered together. While the Pacific hasn't had the same tensions on an equivalent scale as what has been experienced in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, there's been concerns for a long time with Chinese activity in the region. You had Chinese intelligence gathering activities and aid programs raising the ire of some states. You had the South China Sea and East China Sea incidents then introducing more serious maritime security concerns. This actually drew the cabinet level engagement here in the United States. These concerns and others have slowly but measurably driven stronger cooperation between the United States, New Zealand, Japan, and Australia. In fact, the Allies are now working on broadening and deepening their coordination on Pacific affairs, partly as a consequence of Chinese assertiveness elsewhere in the Pacific. So what roles and what opportunities lie ahead, and what risks are also imparted as consequences? When you look at the future of the Pacific region and the opportunities for Pacific states, they're growing. Competition and interest breeds opportunity. Right now, one of the major focuses of all the Western countries who are engaged in the region is building capacity. You hear it time and time again. There is a focus on trying to provide the capability for countries to have sustainable economic development, to be able to respond to non-traditional security issues, to participate in increasing free trade opportunities. You also talk about having development aid become more adaptable to the requirements of the local communities, so that the aid projects actually have a continuous benefit far beyond the lifetime of a building. These opportunities are opportunities for the Pacific countries, but I would actually argue they're also opportunities for the major powers. When you think about the role of the major powers in the Pacific, I think you also have to think about the role of the Pacific with the major powers. There's a two-way feedback mechanism that exists here. And there's a huge opportunity when Pacific countries see aid being given to them that doesn't benefit their needs. There is an opportunity to engage that partner and have a conversation and provide feedback to the partner, because the partner is actually investing in your country for their own reasons, their own national interests. And there's an opportunity through that feedback mechanism to potentially change values and change perceptions and share knowledge. And it goes both ways. When you look at China's interests moving forward in the region, clearly its core interests will continue to predominate. Sovereignty is a huge issue for China, and that's why we have countries that still recognize Taiwan in the region. That will continue to be a focus, and China will continue to try to erode recognition, although not as actively as it previously did because of sort of normalization of relations with Taiwan. But when you look at economic growth, many people consider economic growth to be one of the core reasons for legitimacy of the Chinese government. And so there is going to be a focus on natural resources in the Pacific region, and it has to be acknowledged that it's not just China's interest, it's also Japan's interest, especially with energy. It's the US, it's Australia, it's New Zealand. Everyone has an interest in these commodities and these natural resources. Looking ahead, one of the big focuses for the region has to be on sustainably using these resources in a way that builds long-term benefit for the Pacific Island countries. And I see that as the greatest opportunity looking forward for the Pacific. When the Pacific looks at itself 15 years from now and it thinks about what it has achieved, it'll have to look at a report card which will be chock full of engagements with the US, with Australia, with New Zealand, with China, with many countries around the world. And when it thinks about the major powers' interests, it also needs to think about its own. And it needs to think about when it actually evaluates each individual opportunity, what's in the best interest of the Pacific? And I think right now, when you look at the opportunities that exist, there's quite a few. And you need to give account on individual opportunities. But when you take the lump sum and you look forward at where the Pacific goes from here, the Pacific's in need of one thing, and that thing is a long-term security. The Pacific cannot exist on its own. It has to exist as part of Asia. And when you think about the large narrative that I provided on the Asia-Pacific and where the Asia-Pacific is going, there's opportunities for competition, there's opportunities for cooperation. There's concerns, there's also interest in working together. The Pacific needs to live in that reality just like all the other countries of Asia. And that's going to be the biggest challenge for the region.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Thank you. In the interest of time, I think what I'll do is sum up, unless anybody has an urgent question for the panel. We could probably take one. Okay, I thought so. I know that Pacific Night is awaiting. But I would say I want to thank this panel because I think what we've seen here is very compelling. This is a region that presents enormous hopefulness through its dynamism, and it is a key part of Asia. It also faces what Ambassador Moses outlined, existential challenges that we all should care about. I think taking a page from Minister McCulley, what I heard him say is, we need to get things done. I think that was his direct quote. I think this panel has outlined a pretty compelling set of opportunities and issues for us if we work together to actually get things done in the Pacific. And let me wrap up by thanking each of our panelists, thanking the Embassy of New Zealand, and particularly Ambassador Moore, for their kind hospitality, and thanking all of you for coming. Enjoy the night. Thanks the panel, and have a good evening.